Hi, this video is going to talk about how to multiply integers. So first of all, let's take a look at what multiplication actually means. When I look at the multiplication problem of 4 times 5, that means 4 5s being added. 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 20. So then, multiplication is just repeated addition. Now let's take a look at how that might affect our problem if we have a negative number involved. 4 times negative 5 means I have negative 5 being added 4 times. And we know from our study of adding integers that when I add 4 integers and they all have the same sign, I add the absolute values and get 20, and then my answer is negative. Since we were using 4 times negative 5 to start with, let's just keep using those numbers. I've got 4 times negative 5, which gives me negative 20. 3 times negative 5 means 3 negative 5s being added for a negative 15. 2 negative 5s gives me a negative 10. 1 negative 5 gives me negative 5. And 0 times negative 5 is 0. So now I want to look again at these products and see if we can establish a pattern that will help us continue studying this. So notice what's happening to the first number. To get from 4 to 3, I subtract 1. To get from 3 to 2, I go down by 1 again. To get from 2 to 1, I go down by 1 again, and the same here. So I'm subtracting 1 or going down by 1 each time. Now, here, to get from negative 20 to negative 15, I actually add 5. To get from negative 15 to negative 10, I add 5. To get from negative 10 to negative 5, I add 5. To get from negative 5 to 0, I add 5. So now let's see what happens if we continue those patterns. Alright, I've continued the pattern for the next 4 sets of numbers. If I continue to go down by 1 on the left and go up by 5 on the right, look what happens to my product. I went from having a positive to a negative giving me a negative number to having 2 negatives giving me a positive product. Now here's something else I would like you to take a look at, and that would be the absolute value. 4 times 5 is 20. 3 times 5 is 15. 2 times 5 is 10. 1 times 5 is 5. 0 times 5 is 0. 1 times 5 is 5. 2 times 5 is 10. 3 times 5 is 15. And 4 times 5 is 20. So it looks like what happens here is we can just multiply the absolute values and then decide what sign goes on the answer. So the sign that's going to go on the answer, it looks like, is going to be determined by how many negative numbers I have. If I have one of each, the answer is negative. If I have 2 negatives, it looks like the answer is positive, and that's exactly the way it works. So here's the simple rule for deciding the sign on your products. The product of 2 positive numbers is positive. The product of 2 negative numbers is positive, like we saw down here, and the product of a negative and a positive number is negative. Let's see if we can use patterns again to help us come up with a rule. If I have negative 2 times negative 2, we get a positive 4 because our rule is if we have 2 negatives, our product is positive. Now look at this next one. I know from the problem above that negative 2 times negative 2 is 4, and now I'm supposed to multiply it times a negative 2. Well, when I have a positive and a negative, my answer is negative, and I get negative 8. Now look at this problem. We know from the problem above that this much of it is a negative 8. And I'm supposed to multiply by negative 2 again. Well, now I've got 2 negatives, so the product is going to be a positive 16. And the same thing here from the previous problem. I know that this much is 16, and then I'm supposed to take it times negative 2 again. And this time I've got one of each, so I get a negative 32. So let's see if we can draw a conclusion here. Here I had two negative numbers, and that gave me a positive answer. Here I had three negatives, and I got a negative answer. Here I had four negatives, and I got a positive answer. And then here I had five negatives, and I got a negative answer. Do you see the pattern that we end up with? It looks like if I have an even number of negatives, my answer will be positive. If I have an odd number of negatives, my answer will be negative. Here's one last little device to help you remember, and it's the word nope. The NO means the product is negative if the number of negatives is odd. The PE means the product is positive if the number of negatives is even. Negative for odd, positive for even. The word is nope. So just remember, when you multiply, whether it's two numbers or a string of numbers, you multiply the absolute values, totally ignoring the sign, and then when you finish, add up the negatives. If you have an odd number of negatives, your product is negative. If you have an even number of negatives, your product is positive.